The day before my dad's birthday, I stood outside my childhood home, holding a photo album I spent weeks putting together, only to realize I wasn't even invited to the celebration happening inside. They planned the whole thing behind my back, lied to him, lied to me. But what they didn't know was that I still had 2 plane tickets. And the next morning, when I sat alone at the airport gate, the last person I expected to see came rushing toward me, suitcase in hand, eyes full of regret. This isn't a story about revenge, it's about choosing connection over performance, and what happens when you stop chasing the people who keep rewriting your place in the family. My name's Rachel. I'm 34, a market researcher living in San Francisco. And until recently, I thought loyalty and love would always be enough to hold a family together. Stay with me, because by the end you'll understand why sometimes walking away with grace is the only way to walk back into your own life. There's a dusty old theater on Geary Boulevard with red velvet curtains that hang too low and a marquee that hasn't changed in years. On Sundays, if you squint past the graffiti and the faded movie posters, you'll see it still runs old black and white films, the kind that don't come with explosions or fanfare, just silent subtitles and slow aching truths. Most people pass it by assuming it's closed. But for me, that theater used to be the center of the universe. When I was a child, my father and I had a standing date first Sunday of every month, 11 a.m. matinee. He'd check the paper for the schedule, never online, always the paper, and circle our pick with a black pen. We never missed a month for almost 7 years. He was a professor of East Asian culture, and he loved Kurosawa the way some people love Beethoven or Van Gogh, Rashomon, Ikiru, Seven Samurai. He knew every frame, every monologue, but he didn't treat it like homework. He treated it like art, like worship. I didn't always understand the films. At 8 or 9, I couldn't grasp the depth of a Ronin's moral dilemma or the silence in a grieving man's walk through a rainy alley, but I didn't need to. What I understood was the ritual, the rhythm of our Sundays. He'd make popcorn at home, put it into brown paper bags so we didn't have to buy the overpriced theater kind. I always sat on his left because he liked to write imaginary notes with his right hand, fingers twitching as if he were translating the film in real time. He'd lean over mid-scene whispering things like, "Notice how long he holds that look. That's the moment the audience is supposed to feel it." Or, "This isn't just a sword fight. It's a conversation." I'd nod, not fully grasping what he meant, but loving that he included me in his world. He called me kiddo. That was our thing. I wasn't Rachel in those dark velvet seats. I was Kiddo, his quiet sidekick in a world of black and white morality and poetic monologues. I didn't know what Kurosawa meant to the academic world, but I knew it meant something sacred to my dad, and through him, to me. But like most good things, the ritual didn't last. It ended slowly then, all at once. My mom, efficient, practical, always concerned with optics, started making comments. Is this really the best use of her time? Shouldn't she be working on extracurriculars? Colleges won't care about old samurai movies. I remember the first Sunday we missed. She scheduled a piano audition during our movie hour without asking. Dad didn't protest. He just sighed and said we could go next month. We didn't. The second month, she filled my calendar with debate prep and a science fair project. By the third, the paper went unread and the popcorn bag stayed folded in the kitchen drawer. I didn't fight it. I was 12. I thought this was just what growing up looked like, trading softness for structure. But my father left breadcrumbs. Sometimes he'd leave a Criterion DVD on my desk with a post-it note. If you ever want to remember? Sometimes I'd find an article printed from an obscure blog tucked into my backpack, circled with comments like, "Reminds me of our Sundays." I'd read them late at night under my blanket, like secrets. He never said he missed it. He just kept offering ways back in. Then there was the map. Above his desk in the study was a carved wooden map of Japan. He'd bought it at a museum exhibit years before and mounted it with care, tiny pins marking cities he longed to see. Kyoto always had a red pin. He used to say it with a kind of reverence. Kyoto, not Tokyo, not Osaka, but Kyoto, the city that never gave up on quiet beauty. He spoke about Kyoto like someone speaks about their first love, not with drama but with ache. He told me stories about the streets lined with wooden houses, the stone paths behind shrines, the spring wind carrying petals like snow. He'd show me photos in old books, Not digital slideshows, but grainy printed photographs of monks raking gardens and children feeding koi in temple ponds. One night when I was 15, we were washing dishes after dinner. He asked casually, "If you could go anywhere in the world, where would it be?" I shrugged. "Maybe Paris. Or Iceland." He smiled. "Kyoto," he said. "If I could go anywhere, it'd be Kyoto, during cherry blossom season. With you." I looked at him, unsure if he was serious. "Why with me?" He rinsed a bowl and said, "Because you'd actually see it." I didn't know what he meant until years later. Now at 34, I sit alone in my small apartment kitchen staring at an email notification announcing his retirement. 65, after 4 decades of lectures, conferences, and shaping young minds, he should be celebrated. He should be surprised with something that doesn't come wrapped in a tie box or labeled gift card. He should be given something that takes him back. That night, I opened my laptop and searched Kyoto Cherry Blossom Forecast 2024. Not out of obligation, not even out of nostalgia, but because I wanted to bring back the part of us that had gotten lost in the space between growing up and letting go. I wanted to give him a memory before time did what time always does: erase the lines too faint to remember. This wouldn't be a vacation. It would be a return. The dinner table had always been my mother's stage. She orchestrated every element, from the floral napkin rings to the wine pairings, with the kind of precision that made even casual meals feel rehearsed. So I should have known better than to bring up Kyoto over the roasted chicken and her signature sage carrots. Still, I did. It was a quiet Thursday in January. Rain streaked the windows of their suburban dining room, and the soft hum of jazz played from the Bluetooth speaker in the corner. I had planned the moment carefully. I'd printed out a mock itinerary. Nothing final, just ideas. Ryokan Options Cherry Blossom Forecasts, a calligraphy class I thought my dad might like. The paper was neatly folded beside my plate, weighted down by a glass of water I hadn't touched. Dad was at the head of the table, swirling his wine cheeks pink from the second glass. Mom sat across from me, stiff-backed as always, her eyes flitting between her plate and the kitchen. Darren, my older brother, had shown up late as usual, phone in one hand, fork in the other. "I've been working on something." I started, pushing the paper toward Dad. "For your birthday. I know it's a few months out, but—" He opened the paper and immediately smiled, the kind that started in the eyes. "Kyoto," he said, his voice catching. "You've remembered." My mother looked up sharply. "I thought I said carefully we could go together, just the two of us. Spring is perfect timing for the cherry blossoms, and well, it's always been our thing, hasn't it?" For a few seconds there was silence, and then my mother reached for the butter dish. "That's ambitious," she said mildly, as if I'd suggested skydiving into a war zone. She didn't look at the paper, just passed the butter to Darren. Darren smirked. "Japan's kind of intense, huh? Long flights, unfamiliar food, lots of walking. Is Dad even up for that?" Dad glanced at him, then back at the paper. "I'm more up for it than you'd think." "Still," my mom said, folding her napkin with unnecessary force, "a local celebration might be more inclusive. You know, for everyone. Friends, family, the people who matter to him." That last part hit harder than I expected. I tried to keep my voice light. "Well, I thought this would be something personal. For Dad. A trip he's talked about for decades." She smiled the way people do when they disagree but don't want to look rude. "Let's not make this about individual preferences. Birthdays are about unity." Dad opened his mouth to speak but seemed to think better of it. He patted my hand instead and said, "It's a beautiful idea, kiddo." That was the last time anyone at the table acknowledged it. In the days that followed, I sent emails, logistics, price ranges, travel requirements. I even offered to handle passports and vaccinations. But my mother never replied. She claimed she was swamped with volunteer work. Darren responded once with a one-word "cool." That was it. I dropped by the house twice, hoping to catch them with free time. Both times my mother was just stepping out, apron still on, hair too perfect for errands. The second time, she'd scheduled a neighborhood committee meeting in the living room at the exact hour I'd mentioned I'd come over. Dad, sweet as ever, kept asking little questions whenever we spoke. "Do you think the cherry blossoms will peak in early April, or what's the proper way to bow in a temple again?" He was clearly excited. But something had shifted. He seemed hesitant now, as if uncertain where his own wishes fit into the larger family framework. One evening, about 2 weeks later, I stopped by unannounced. The house was quiet. I walked toward the kitchen, planning to leave a new itinerary update on the counter. That's when I heard their voices. They were in the den. Mom and Darren. Doors half closed, but not latched. I stood outside, still as stone. "We can't let her make this whole thing about herself," my mom was saying. "It's Mark's birthday, not some nostalgia tour for her." Darren laughed softly. "She's always doing this. Big gestures. Emotional theatrics. It's exhausting. She thinks this makes her look like the perfect daughter," Mom said, her voice edged with something sharp. "But Mark needs to be celebrated here. With the people who've actually been around. We'll plan something tasteful, elegant, at home. And she'll find out when I haven't decided yet," she replied. "She'll overreact either way." I didn't wait to hear more. I backed away, my fingers' numb, heart ticking like a loose metronome. They weren't just ignoring my idea. They were replacing it, deliberately, methodically, and keeping it a secret. Not from me, but from him. Planning the trip to Kyoto became my nighttime ritual. After work, I'd pull out my laptop, dim the lights, and lose myself in the details. Ryokan guest houses with sliding paper doors and cedar bathtubs, morning tea ceremonies beneath blooming cherry trees, a half-day bento-making class led by a woman who had been a chef for 42 years. I imagined my father's quiet wonder, the way he'd tilt his head and say, "Huh," whenever something moved him. It wasn't just logistics. It was love disguised as a spreadsheet. I booked the flights first, direct from San Francisco to Kansai. Premium economy, not luxury, but enough legroom for Dad to stretch out and not feel his age. I even called ahead to the airline to request a low-sodium meal for him and confirmed he wouldn't need to lift a finger at customs. Every detail felt like a small rebellion against how unseen he'd been lately. The ryokan took longer. I emailed back and forth with a woman named Hanae, who ran a family inn outside of Arashiyama. She apologized for her English. I apologized for not speaking Japanese. We ended up bonding over our fathers. Hers still carved wooden statues by hand. Mine still wrote essays that no one asked for. She promised to prepare the room with extra cushions for Dad's knees. I attached the confirmation email to a scrapbook folder labeled April, Kyoto. Every piece was a promise. "You matter. I see you. I haven't forgotten." Meanwhile, my mother began a slow campaign of disapproval. Nothing direct, just comments. "Kyoto's lovely, but April's so humid. Your father's sinuses won't like that. I read that Japanese beds are right on the floor. You know he has back issues. 13 hours in the air, that's a long time for a man his age." Each statement was said in passing, over tea, over texts between errands, never hostile, just concerned, just reasonable enough to plant doubt. I nodded, smiled, and said, "We've got it covered." But I could feel it, the way she withdrew just a little more each time, the way she spoke about the trip like it was a fantasy I would eventually grow out of. Dad was different. He was giddy in a quiet, steady way. He started sending me short videos from a YouTube channel called Japanese in 5 Minutes, where a cheerful man taught basic phrases. One afternoon, I opened an email from him with the subject line, "Foxes and Torii Gates." It was a photo of Fushimi Inari. Shrine, the red arches twisting into the forest like a dream. "Did you know they have over 10,000 gates? We have to see it." He still said we. He'd begun telling his old university colleagues too. I got CC'd on an email he sent to a former grad student with the line, "Rachel's making an old man's dream come true." Reading it made me smile and ache all at once. Because no one else in the family ever replied to the itinerary updates. Not Mom, not Darren. I sent link suggestions, open-ended questions. Nothing. I told myself they were busy. I told myself they didn't need to respond. This was about Dad and me. I told myself I wasn't asking for permission. But then came the text. I was walking home from the grocery store, the sky streaked in soft gold and lilac, when my phone buzzed. "Darren. We've all talked. It's better if you sit this one out. It's Dad's day and Mom's been planning this for months." I stopped walking. I read the message again and again. It wasn't cruel. It wasn't even long, but it said everything. They hadn't told me not to go. They hadn't told me not to plan. They hadn't said, "You're not invited." Instead, they made a plan around me. They scheduled, decided, and coordinated together. And I was never looped in. I had been writing the script to a film that no one else showed up for. I didn't respond. What could I say that wouldn't fall flat against that gentle, passive certainty they didn't have to fight me? They had erased me, quietly, efficiently. And the silence had done all the cutting. That night, I sat at my kitchen table with the itinerary open on my screen and stared at it for an hour. Everything was still there. The dates, the names, the little note from Hanai that read, "We will be honored to host your family story." It was still my story. But I was the only one writing it. I tried calling him on a Tuesday evening just after the rain started. The drops tapped lightly against my kitchen window, soft and rhythmic like the beginning of a film score. I stood barefoot, still holding the envelope that had arrived that morning. Another flyer for someone else's retirement celebration, this one with golden balloons and smiling faces. I set it on the counter and picked up my phone, pulling up Dad's name. The first call rang twice, then went to voicemail. The second, a few minutes later, didn't ring at all. Straight to voicemail, as if someone had declined it. I told myself maybe he was napping. Maybe he'd left his phone in another room, or it had died. Maybe he was watching a movie and didn't want to pause it. But he always picked up, or at least texted, especially after 2 missed calls. So I waited. An hour passed. The rain thickened into a slow, insistent downpour. The streetlights outside flickered into gold puddles on the wet pavement. I heated leftover curry, barely touched it. At 9:17 p.m., I finally heard the buzz of a reply. "Talk later. Things are chaotic here." That was it. No punctuation. No "hey kiddo." No warmth. No questions. Just 5 words that felt like a steel door closing. I stared at the message for a long time, thumb hovering over the screen. I thought about replying, "Everything okay?" Or "Chaotic how?" Or even "Call me when you can." But I didn't send anything. I just stood there in the quiet hum of my apartment, staring at the message like it might shift in meaning if I stared long enough. Chaotic. What does that even mean? I imagined my mother in the living room pacing, drafting seating charts, rehearsing whatever version of the truth she'd decided was most acceptable that week. I imagined my brother nodding along, phone in hand, chiming in only when asked. And I imagined my father, somewhere in the house, not quite sure what he was supposed to know, what he was supposed to feel, or what part he was supposed to play in the new script being written without me. A cold knowing settled into my chest like fog through a cracked window. She had gotten to him. I didn't know how, not exactly, but I knew the signs, the distance, the delay, the word chaotic as a catch-all excuse for absence. It wasn't a refusal. It wasn't even rejection. It was evasion. The kind that doesn't raise alarms but still erases you quietly and efficiently. I had spent weeks building this trip, booking flights, translating train schedules, confirming dietary preferences with Ryokan hosts who replied at 3 a.m. Their time just to be helpful. I had scoured blog posts for the best times to visit Fushimi Inari and researched the etiquette for temple visits. I even printed out a laminated phrase card for my father in case he got separated and needed help. I had thought of everything except this, the kind of betrayal that doesn't come with a fight, just silence. That night, I sat at my desk and opened the Kyoto Tripmaster sheet. It had 6 tabs: flights, lodging, food, excursions, language, and backup plan. I scrolled through each one like I was flipping through pages of a scrapbook for a life that might never exist. I started with the excursions. The bento making class. Cancelled. The guided walk through Philosopher's Path. Gone. The family-friendly tea ceremony with Hane's grandmother as host. Refunded. Every click felt like closing a window to something I'd imagined with so much care, so much intention. But I didn't hesitate. There was a strange freedom in the efficiency, in not asking for permission anymore, in not explaining myself. I moved to the flights. 4 names were on the reservation, mine, Dad's, Darren's, and my mother's. I deleted Darren and Linda. The system asked if I wanted to notify the removed passengers. I unchecked the box. When it prompted me for a reason, I typed, change in guest list. I kept my father's ticket. And mine. The ryokan was next. I wrote to Hanai Hai again, thank you so much for the welcome package offer. We'll be 2 guests instead of 4. If possible, we'd prefer a smaller room now. Still with the mountain view if available. I appreciate all your help. She replied in less than an hour. Of course, Ms. Rachel. We will prepare everything for you and your father. And no matter how many guests, your story is always welcome here. I closed my laptop and sat in silence. No music, no lights except the one above the sink. The rain had slowed outside, just a mist now brushing the window. I picked up my phone, stared at Dad's message again. Talk later. Things are chaotic here. No, we wouldn't talk later. Not unless he chose to. I set the phone face down, then opened a drawer and placed it inside. I didn't turn it off. I didn't block anyone. I didn't write a dramatic goodbye. I simply opted out. Of justifying. Of translating myself into something more palatable for people who never really asked how I was doing. I had tried. I had built something beautiful. And then I'd been told, not directly, of course that would have been too messy, that it wasn't wanted, that I wasn't wanted. And now I was done reaching. If he wants to know what happened, I thought not bitter, just tired he'll have to ask. Not because I wanted to punish him, but because for once in my life I wanted to be chosen without having to perform. Some goodbyes don't come in words. Sometimes they arrive quietly wearing the clothes of dignity. And when they do, all that's left is to let them walk in peace. The photo album was wrapped in craft paper and tied with a simple ribbon. No card, no glitter, just something real. I had spent 2 weeks assembling it. Old photos I'd scanned from shoeboxes in the garage, ticket stubs from our movie days, a paper crane I'd folded from one of Dad's lecture handouts in high school. The last page held a printed itinerary: Kyoto, April, room for 2. It wasn't meant to be a surprise. It was meant to be a reminder of what we were still allowed to hope for. I parked a block away from the house, partly out of habit, partly out of hesitation. There were already too many cars lining the driveway and curb. I recognized several: my uncle's truck, Aunt Diane's silver crossover, even Mom's yoga friend's hybrid. The front door was open just enough to let the laughter spill out. It was loud, carefree. Glasses clinked, someone cheered from the backyard, and faint music floated from what sounded like a speaker tucked into the bushes. I stood on the sidewalk with the package in my hands and tried to steady my breath. It wasn't supposed to be today. Dad's birthday was tomorrow. This, whatever this was, hadn't been mentioned in any group chat because I hadn't been in one. No invitation, no RSVP request, not even a passive-aggressive hope you can make it. Just silence. I walked toward the house slowly, the gravel crunching under my shoes. As I reached the porch, I caught sight of the banner strung across the living room window. Happy 65th mark, bold letters, gold fringe, centered above a table stacked with cupcakes and framed photos. None of which I noticed included me. Through the open window I saw faces I hadn't seen in years. Former neighbors, old co-workers, friends of friends. Everyone smiling. Everyone gathered. Everyone belonging. Except for the one person who should have been at the center of it all. I didn't see my father. I stood there for another minute, unsure what to do. The photo album was starting to feel heavy in my hands. Or maybe it was just my arms. Then from the side of the house a familiar voice broke through. Rachel. I turned. It was Jerome. One of Dad's oldest friends from the university. He looked surprised, but not unkind. He stepped toward me, his hands in the pockets of his khaki windbreaker, the same kind he'd worn since the early 2000s. I didn't know you were coming, he said gently. I didn't either, I replied. We stood in awkward silence for a moment before he leaned in, slightly lowering his voice. Your dad looked confused earlier, he said. He kept saying he thought he was going to Japan with you. Asked if anyone had packed his suitcase yet. My throat tightened. He's not here, I asked, already knowing the answer. Jerome shook his head. Left about an hour ago. Said he needed some air. Took a walk, I think. He didn't say much, just didn't look like himself. The edges of my vision blurred slightly. I blinked, grounding myself with the weight of the album in my arms. I think he believed this was going to be different, Jerome added. That you two were leaving this weekend. I nodded, swallowing back a dozen responses I knew I'd never say out loud. I should go, I murmured. Jerome stepped back. You sure? I'm sure they'd. But we both knew they wouldn't. I turned and walked back down the driveway. No one called out. No one noticed I'd been there at all. As I reached my car, I heard another burst of laughter from the backyard, the kind that felt too loud for its own good, like a laugh track covering for something broken. I placed the album gently on the passenger seat and sat there for a while, watching the house through the windshield. I thought about going back in, about finding my mother, looking her in the eye and asking what she thought she'd accomplished. But I didn't. Because I already knew. This wasn't about celebration, it was about control. It was about narrative. It was about making sure the image stayed intact. A perfect party, with perfect guests, curated memories for curated people. And me? I wasn't part of that story. I wasn't even a footnote. So I started the car, and I drove away carrying the only real gift he would never get to open, a quiet collection of the life we actually lived. The airport was unusually quiet for a Friday morning. I arrived just after 7:30 a.m., a small carry-on in one hand, a travel pouch in the other. Inside were 2 passports, 2 boarding passes, and a pair of noise-canceling headphones my dad once said he'd try if someone else set them up. I hadn't slept much. I didn't bother trying. Instead, I spent the night walking through memories like rooms in an old house. The rickety staircase of disappointment, the living room of guilt, the kitchen where hope still sat unfinished. I packed in silence, said nothing to anyone, and took the first rideshare I could find. When I reached Gate 74, the flight to Osaka was already boarding families with small children. I sat near the window and watched the line form. Couples in matching neck pillows, businessmen on their 5th email of the morning, a teenager scribbling kanji in the margins of a manga volume. I opened my pouch and pulled out the boarding passes. 2 names. Still, I hadn't removed his. Not because I thought he'd come. I didn't. I just couldn't bring myself to erase the seat beside me. The boarding agent made an announcement, something about Group 4. I folded the tickets and held them in my lap, letting my fingers trace the edge of the paper. A habit left over from childhood, like chewing pen caps or overpacking Band-Aids. That's when my phone buzzed. Just once. I didn't recognize the number at first, but the preview line made my breath catch. I found your itinerary. I tapped it open with a trembling thumb. I found your itinerary. I packed a bag. Don't leave yet. Dad. That was it. No punctuation, no emoji, just 10 words that unraveled something I had tied so tightly around my ribs. I didn't move. Not right away. I just read it again and again, until the gate announcements turned into white noise and the people became shadows passing in slow motion. Then from the far end of the terminal, I saw him. He was jogging in that half-dignified, half-rushed way men his age do when they're too stubborn to admit they're out of breath. His navy windbreaker flapped slightly behind him, and in one hand he dragged an overstuffed rolling suitcase. Not the carry-on kind, but the one we used to take on road trips that required winter coats and board games. He spotted me before I could wave. And when he reached me, he didn't speak at first. Just stood there, breathing hard, his glasses slipping down the bridge of his nose. He looked tired. Not just physically, but emotionally undone in a way I'd only ever seen once. The day his mother passed, and he forgot how to tie his tie at the funeral. I found your folder, he said finally, still catching his breath. The one with the photo album, the itinerary, the train schedules, the sticky notes. I didn't say anything. He swallowed hard. They told me you'd canceled, that you changed your mind, that you didn't want me to come. I met his eyes. You believed them, I asked, not accusatory, just raw. I didn't want to, he said. But they were so sure. And you weren't answering. I nodded once. I stopped reaching. He lowered his eyes, the weight of that sentence sinking into him like gravity. I should have asked you, he said. Directly. I should have known. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. It was my original itinerary. The one I'd left tucked inside the photo album I never gave him. I read every page he said, every little margin note. And I thought, why would you go through all that trouble if you didn't mean it? I opened the pouch again and handed him the second boarding pass. He looked down at it, then back up at me. You didn't cancel my ticket. No, I said. I canceled theirs. A long pause passed between us. Not uncomfortable, just weighty with meaning. Let's go see some cherry blossoms, Dad, I said softly. He smiled. Not a big smile, not one for cameras or crowds, just a small private one, the kind that starts in the corner of the mouth and makes its way to the eyes like dawn. We walked to the gate together. And when the boarding agent scanned our tickets and wished us a pleasant journey, I felt something inside me shift. Not entirely healed, not fixed, but breathing again. Sometimes love isn't loud. It doesn't come in party banners or speeches or family group texts. Sometimes love is just showing up suitcase in hand at gate 74. Kyoto in spring is not a place. It's a feeling. The moment we stepped off the Shinkansen, the world seemed to slow. The air was different, softer, as if it had passed through generations of quiet gardens and picked up the scent of old stories. The cherry trees were just beginning to open, delicate and unsure, like they were asking permission to bloom. We arrived at the ryokan in Arashiyama just before dusk. Hanae greeted us with a deep bow, her eyes kind and knowing. Welcome home, she said in halting English, and somehow it felt true. Our room overlooked a small river that whispered even in stillness. Tatami mats underfoot, sliding doors to the veranda, two futons arranged with reverence. Dad stood there for a long time, taking it in. This feels honest, he said. The next morning we walked through the Arashiyama bamboo grove, the stalks towering above us like green cathedrals. The sound of the wind rustling through the leaves was unlike anything else. Not quite music, not quite silence. Dad paused halfway through the path, running his hand over one of the smooth trunks. You know, he said, every time I watch Kurosawa now, I see a 9-year-old with tangled hair sitting beside me, laughing at things she didn't understand. I smiled. I didn't need to understand, I said quietly. I just remember your hand on my shoulder. That was the story. He didn't reply, just nodded, blinking faster than usual. Later we ducked into a tiny ramen shop tucked behind a shrine. It had only 6 seats, and the owner wore a white apron stained with broth in memory. We ate in silence, slurping noodles, sipping broth, letting the steam warm places in us we didn't know had gone cold. That afternoon we took a bus to a small village known for its paper crafts. An elderly couple welcomed us into their shop and taught us how to fold cranes from rice paper dyed with natural pigments. I fumbled my first attempt. Dad made 2. One slightly crooked one, nearly perfect. He handed me the perfect one. For the shelf back home, he said. I placed it gently in my bag beside the photo album I still hadn't given him. The days blurred in the way that only good ones do. Each one simple, measured. No grand tourist agenda, no pressure to perform happiness. Just slow walks, quiet meals, old stories. Each night we returned to the ryokan, soaked our feet in the wooden tub, and watched the moon rise over the river. On our 3rd day, we found a grove of cherry trees along the banks of the Katsura River. The blossoms were just beginning to fall, dotting the path like confetti from a parade no one had asked for. We sat on a bench beneath one of the older trees, its trunk gnarled and graceful. Dad reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small package wrapped in cloth. He handed it to me without a word. Inside was a napkin. Plain white, slightly creased, the kind you'd find at a cafe. Scrawled across it in his unmistakable handwriting. To my daughter. For seeing me even when others tried to turn me away. I looked at the napkin. Then at him. I found it in my jacket pocket this morning, he said. Wrote it on the plane and forgot I had it. I didn't speak. just folded the napkin with care and placed it into the back of the photo album still tucked in my satchel. We sat like that for a long time, saying nothing, just listening to the river, the wind, the quiet rhythm of petals falling around us like soft punctuation. Eventually, Dad broke the silence. "I let them speak for me," he said, "and in doing that, I almost lost you." "You didn't lose me," I replied, "but you forgot I was there." He turned to face me. "I didn't forget," he said. "I just got quiet. And I didn't realize how much you'd been carrying." I didn't cry, not because it didn't matter, but because it did. The tears would come later. Maybe on the flight home, maybe while folding laundry. But in that moment, what mattered most was presence. Two people, two stories, finally being told to each other in full. Coming home didn't feel like coming back. I stepped through the door of my apartment and set my suitcase down as I always did. Keys in the bowl by the entrance, shoes off at the mat jacket over the chair. But something had shifted. Not the walls, not the lighting or the air. Me. The silence no longer felt hollow. It felt earned. I unpacked slowly, giving each item its place, not rushing to restore order, but letting each piece settle back into the rhythm of my space. The matcha tin from Kyoto sat on the windowsill, catching the early light like a reminder. The paper crane, the one my father folded and handed me with quiet ceremony, went on the bookshelf, nestled between old Murakami novels. The napkin with his handwritten note. To my daughter. For seeing me even when others tried to turn me away, I tucked inside the last page of my photo album, a kind of private truth preserved in paper. For the first time in months, maybe years, I didn't feel like I was holding my breath inside my own home. 3 days after we landed, my phone lit up with a message. No context, no greeting. Just text sitting heavy on the screen like an unopened letter from another life. "I hope you're happy. You embarrassed this family." It was from my mother. I read it 3 times, waiting for my pulse to rise, waiting for the familiar ache in my throat, the reflex to respond, to smooth it over, to rewrite her version of me. But it didn't come. Instead, I sat down at the kitchen table, opened my laptop, and reread the note my father left me on that napkin. Then I typed out my reply to her, short and without ceremony. "I'm no longer here to perform for your version of family." I hit send. No punctuation. No further message. I closed my phone and didn't check it again for the rest of the day. A year ago, I would have explained. I would have justified the choices I made. The money spent, the hurt I carried, the seat I saved for someone who had no intention of sitting beside me. But now I understood silence could be a kind of clarity too. 2 days later, Darren called. I let it ring 4 times before answering. Not out of spite. I just wasn't in a hurry anymore to rescue anyone from discomfort. "Hey," he said, his voice tight. "I wasn't sure you'd pick up." "I almost didn't," I said plainly. A long pause followed. "I'm sorry," he began, already stumbling. "I shouldn't have gone along with it. With Mom. With everything. I don't even know what I was thinking. It just seemed easier." Another pause. Not out of tension. Just absence. "I thought you'd be fine," he added, softer. I didn't respond. I let the weight of his words sit there, heavy and unfinished. "I messed up," he said finally. "Yes," I replied. More silence. "I hope we can talk," he added. "We just did." I said, "Let's not pretend it didn't happen." I didn't hang up. But I didn't offer him a lifeline either. Some truths needed to hang in the air without being folded back into small talk. After that call, we didn't speak again. At least not right away. And I didn't chase the absence. Because somewhere between Kyoto and now, I'd stopped mistaking connection for obligation. But my father? He showed up differently. Every Sunday morning, like clockwork, he started sending me little messages. A photo of his desk with a new novel annotated in pencil. A snapshot of the ceramic teacup he bought from the elderly potter near the Kiyomizu slope. A blurry shot of the taiyaki pastry he tried to make himself, the edges slightly burnt, but endearing. He didn't write long notes. He didn't apologize again. He simply kept showing up. Once he sent me a picture of us beneath the cherry trees taken by a kind stranger who had asked if we wanted a memory. It wasn't posed. I was mid-laugh and Dad was looking sideways at me like he was about to say something worth remembering. "Frame this if you want," he texted. I did. I hung it in the hallway beside the door. Not to show visitors. Not to prove anything. But for me. So I'd remember that even in the quietest moments, something sacred had been salvaged. One Saturday afternoon, I cleared space on the wall above my desk. I unpacked the ink painting I'd bought from a street vendor outside Gion. It was simple. Just two figures, one tall, one small, standing beneath a flurry of falling blossoms. The artist had signed it with a single kanji. I later looked it up. It meant to witness. I mounted it carefully, stepped back, and for a moment, I just stared. There's a difference between being seen and being watched. To be watched is to be measured. Your movements cataloged, your choices cross-examined. But to be seen, that's different. To be seen is to be known. And I was, maybe for the first time in years, not by everyone, not even by most, but by the one person who'd mattered most all along. I stood in that soft silence, framed by ink memory and cherry blossoms that still bloomed even in rooms with no windows. And I knew I had come home, but I hadn't gone back. Have you ever felt like the outsider in your own family? Not because you left, but because they quietly decided you didn't belong. Have you ever given everything only to be left out of the picture? Not with harsh words, but with silence. Rachel's story isn't just about cherry blossoms or plane tickets. It's about what it means to be seen. Not by everyone, but by the ones who truly matter. What about you? Have you ever had to redefine what family means on your own terms? We'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. If this story resonated with you, if it made you feel understood, or gave you the courage to reclaim your voice, please consider liking the video, subscribing to the channel, and turning on the notification bell so you never miss another story that might just speak to your heart. Your journey matters, your healing matters, and you're not alone. Thank you for listening. We'll see you in the next story.